Hawthorne was the kind of village that felt like it had been forgotten by time. Nestled deep in the rolling hills of rural America, it was a place where everyone knew each other's names, where children played freely in the streets, and neighbors exchanged more than just greetings. They shared secrets, joys, and heartaches alike. The village had no real claim to fame, just its quiet charm: a single gas station, a diner that smelled perpetually of fried pies, and the towering old church in the center that seemed to watch over everything. At first glance, Hawthorne seemed perfect. Too perfect, some would later say. Life in the village was simple, almost monotonous. Farmers woke at dawn to tend their fields, shopkeepers polished their counters and swapped stories with regular customers, and every evening, families gathered to share meals and laughter. Technology had barely touched the village. There were no bustling highways or cell towers, just gravel roads winding between wooden houses and dense forests. To outsiders, it might have looked quaint, charming, or even sleepy. But to the residents, Hawthorne was home, safe, and ordinary. That ordinariness would become the first clue that something in the village wasn't quite right. The village had its traditions, too. Every year, the townsfolk celebrated Harvest Night, a festival that brought everyone together in the town square. Lanterns would hang from trees, the smell of pumpkin pies would fill the air, and the church bells would chime as families danced beneath the stars. But despite the warmth and routine, there was an undercurrent of tension, small things that outsiders barely noticed. Windows sometimes rattled on windless nights, and faint footsteps echoed along empty streets. The villagers dismissed these sounds, laughing them off as quirks of old houses or the wind playing tricks, but the sense of unease lingered like a shadow. Neighbors often remarked on the church, a massive stone building with tall spires that pierced the sky. It had always been the center of life in Hawthorne, not just spiritually but socially. Every Sunday, the bell tolled, calling villagers to gather in its pews. Children learned their first prayers there. Weddings were held under its arched ceilings, and even the grumpiest residents would sometimes find themselves humming hymns after a sermon. Yet, for all its beauty, the church carried an air of mystery. It wasn't uncommon for people to glance at the closed doors late at night and feel a chill they couldn't explain. By the summer of 1998, Hawthorne seemed like it had reached the height of its peaceful life. The sun warmed the cobblestone streets, chickens clucked lazily in backyards, and smoke curled gently from chimneys. But that sense of serenity masked something more sinister. Something beneath the surface had been stirring, unnoticed by everyone in the village. The quiet, the routine, the familiarity, it all made Hawthorne feel untouchable, as if the outside world couldn't reach it. And maybe that was exactly what made it vulnerable. That summer, no one would suspect that in the blink of an eye, the ordinary charm of Hawthorne would turn into the ultimate disappearance mystery, one that would haunt anyone who dared to remember it. When the villagers of Hawthorne didn't return that night, neighbors initially thought it was just a strange coincidence. Maybe everyone had gone into the nearby town for supplies, or perhaps there was a festival no one knew about. But by dawn, it became alarmingly clear that something was very wrong. The streets that were normally alive with morning chatter were silent. Dogs barked alone in yards, their owners nowhere in sight. Mailboxes were overflowing, and the scent of breakfast still lingered in homes, untouched. Nothing had been packed, no cars had left, yet the people themselves were gone. Authorities arrived quickly, but even they were baffled. The village had no signs of struggle, no broken windows, no overturned furniture, no forced entries. It was as if every single person had simply vanished into thin air. Emergency services scoured the surrounding forests and hills, searched nearby roads, and even questioned neighbors in adjacent towns. They found nothing. Not a trace. Every home, every street, every corner of Hawthorne was exactly as it had been the night before, except for one impossible fact: there were no people. The church, which had stood proudly at the center of the village for generations, became the focus of speculation. Its doors were locked, yet inside, the bell had stopped at midnight, frozen in the exact moment the villagers disappeared. Some officers swore they heard faint echoes of hymns from within, while others insisted they saw shadows move past the stained glass windows. Rumors started to spread among investigators. Some claimed the building itself was alive, a sentinel watching over the empty streets. Others feared the unimaginable, that the village had been swallowed by something beyond human understanding. Families of the missing villagers were frantic. Parents called relatives and friends, pleading for any clue. Children's toys were still scattered in yards, as if bedtime had been interrupted mid-play. Personal diaries were left open, unfinished letters remained unsent, and meals sat half-eaten on tables. Friends and neighbors couldn't comprehend it, How could an entire community vanish without leaving a single footprint, a single word, or even a scream? News crews came to report on the so-called vanishing village. But they left unsettled, many claiming they had felt an unseen weight pressing down on the town, as though Hawthorne itself was warning them to leave. By the end of the week, Hawthorne was officially declared missing from maps. Authorities labeled it a bizarre case, a collective disappearance, something the world had never seen before. Psychologists and conspiracy theorists speculated wildly, suggesting everything from mass hysteria to alien abduction, but none of it made sense. The village had not moved, no evidence of evacuation existed, and yet the people were gone. In the following months, Hawthorne became a place of whispers, a cautionary tale told to children, and a mystery that no one dared investigate too closely. And through it all, the church remained, silent, ominous, and guarding secrets that might never be uncovered. As months turned into years, Hawthorne became a place that existed more in whispers than on any map. Nearby townspeople spoke of it cautiously, often lowering their voices when the topic arose. Some said the village had been cursed. Others claimed the church had drawn the villagers into some dark ritual. People told stories of seeing strange lights flickering in the church windows at night, glowing in colors that didn't exist in nature. Travelers passing by reported hearing faint music, like a choir singing softly, drifting across empty fields. Those brave enough to approach the church said the air grew unnaturally cold, carrying a heavy weight that made it hard to breathe. Local kids, daring each other to peek at the empty village, claimed they had seen fleeting shadows between the abandoned houses. Some even swore they heard whispers, soft, indistinct, almost like someone calling their names from just beyond the fog. Hunters and hikers avoided the area, convinced something unnatural lingered where the village once thrived. Even the animals were different. Dogs barked at invisible figures, and birds avoided the fields entirely. The church became a magnet for speculation. Locals swore that at times, the bell tolled on its own, echoing across the empty streets. Some claimed to hear chants in languages no one recognized, emanating from the locked doors late at night. A few of the braver townsfolk reported glimpses of figures inside the windows, pale and indistinct, standing perfectly still and staring outward. Tourists and journalists who came to investigate often left shaken, describing feelings of being watched, of unseen eyes following them as they walked through the ruins. Yet every time someone tried to get closer, the atmosphere grew heavier, almost tangible, as if Hawthorne itself was alive and displeased. Rumors evolved into legends. Some said the villagers were trapped in a different dimension, pulled into another reality by a mysterious force tied to the church. Others whispered about government experiments, alien abductions, or a mass hypnotic trance that overtook the population overnight. Each theory seemed more impossible than the last, yet each carried a sense of truth that made hearts race. Letters left by those who had visited the village spoke of cold drafts that carried voices, of shadows that moved just beyond the corner of the eye, and of feelings of intense dread that could paralyze even the strongest of men. Despite the stories, some people refused to believe in anything supernatural. They suggested the disappearance had a rational explanation, maybe even a human one, money troubles, secret cults, or a mass exodus planned in secret. But skeptics struggled to explain the sheer impossibility of it all. Not a single villager had ever been seen again, not a single car, not a single trace of their lives left behind, except for the eerie silence and the ever-watchful church. Over time, Hawthorne became a symbol of fear and fascination, a cautionary tale whispered around campfires and online forums, the village that vanished, leaving only questions, and a growing dread that some secrets were never meant to be uncovered. By 2018, Hawthorne had become a place of legend, shrouded in mystery and overgrown with the relentless march of nature. Vines crept over the cracked sidewalks, wildflowers claimed the fields, and the forest had begun swallowing the edges of the village like it was erasing every trace of human existence. Locals from nearby towns warned visitors to stay away, claiming the place was cursed. But curiosity has a way of overpowering caution, and that's exactly what led a group of urban explorers to the abandoned church one crisp autumn evening. Armed with flashlights, cameras, and a sense of bravado, they stepped into the village that no one had dared enter for decades. The first thing they noticed was how silent it was. Not just quiet, but eerily still. No birds chirped, no wind whispered through the trees, and even their footsteps seemed muffled as though the earth itself absorbed sound. The streets were empty, homes stood like skeletons of their former selves, and the air smelled faintly of smoke and decaying wood. Every building they passed held frozen echoes of life long gone. A rocking chair tilted in a doorway, children's shoes lined up as if waiting for the owners to return, and faded curtains fluttering in broken windows. Hawthorne wasn't just abandoned, it was suspended in time, untouched since that fateful night 20 years ago. As they approached the church, the explorers felt a shift in the air, subtle but unmistakable. The temperature dropped sharply, their breath visible in the dim light, and a weight pressed down on their shoulders as if the building itself were aware of their intrusion. The towering spires of the church loomed above them, casting long shadows over the cracked courtyard. Stained glass windows reflected the last rays of the sun, creating patterns on the ground that seemed almost deliberate, guiding them closer to the entrance. Despite the decay and silence, the church radiated a presence, an aura of authority and danger that made every hair on their necks stand on end. Inside, the church was a cavern of darkness and echoes. Dust floated like tiny specters in the beams of flashlight, and the scent of mildew and old stone hung heavy. The pews were still aligned perfectly, hymnals resting on them as though waiting for a congregation that would never return. Sunlight filtered through the stained glass, casting eerie colors across the floor, illuminating patches of the walls decorated with centuries-old carvings. Every step they took echoed loudly, bouncing off the high ceilings, reminding them how empty the space truly was. It felt like the building itself was breathing, watching, and waiting for them to make a mistake. Then, among the familiar sights of the old church, something caught their eyes, a small, inconspicuous door tucked behind the altar. Unlike the grand entrances they had passed, this door was modest, almost hidden in the shadows. Cobwebs clung to its edges, and layers of dust suggested it hadn't been opened in decades. The explorers paused, exchanging uneasy glances. There was something about it that didn't belong, a feeling that it was meant to remain sealed, guarding a secret no one was supposed to uncover. Yet the pull was irresistible. It was a threshold, a hint that whatever had happened in Hawthorne 20 years ago might finally be revealed, if they dared to step through. The hidden door behind the altar wasn't what the explorers expected. It was small, unassuming, almost blending perfectly into the aged stone wall, as if it had been deliberately designed to remain unnoticed. The wood was dark and warped with age, and iron hinges were rusted solid. Yet there was something about it that radiated an almost palpable energy, an invisible pressure that seemed to push them back while simultaneously pulling them closer. One of the explorers, trembling slightly, ran a hand over the rough surface and felt a faint vibration, like the door itself was alive, waiting, aware of their touch. Dust and cobwebs clung stubbornly to the edges, suggesting that the door hadn't been opened in decades. Yet, as their flashlights caught the brass handle, a strange glint reflected off it, almost like it had been polished recently, or perhaps it was a trick of the mind. They tried pushing, and at first, it didn't budge. Then, with a creak that echoed through the cavernous church, the door began to give way. A cold gust of air burst out, carrying an almost inaudible whisper, too soft to understand, yet unmistakably human. "You shouldn't be here," it seemed to say, sending a shiver down their spines. The explorers hesitated, each one silently acknowledging the fear building in their chests. They had prepared for urban exploration, for abandoned buildings, for darkness, but nothing had prepared them for this. The air beyond the door was colder than anything outside, heavy with a scent that was both earthy and metallic, like damp stone and old blood. Shadows danced along the edges of the doorway, twisted and flickering, making the threshold seem alive. One of them whispered, almost to themselves, "It's like the building doesn't want us here." Finally, summoning every ounce of courage, they stepped through the doorway. A narrow staircase descended sharply into darkness, the walls carved with symbols that made the hairs on their necks stand on end. The carvings were intricate, some geometric, others resembling figures frozen in agony. Dust and decay covered every surface, yet the markings seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light, as though the shadows themselves recognized the intruders. Each step down the staircase echoed too loudly, as if amplified by something unseen, warning them that the deeper they went, the further they strayed from safety. The staircase seemed to descend endlessly, winding deeper than any logical basement could. Their flashlights barely penetrated the darkness, revealing glimpses of the strange, otherworldly architecture. Occasionally, they caught sight of objects half buried in dust, old dolls, broken furniture, rusted tools, and scraps of clothing, remnants of lives abruptly interrupted. And always, there was that whispering presence, just at the edge of hearing, urging them to turn back, yet binding them with a curiosity they couldn't resist. Something unimaginable awaited at the bottom, something tied to the fate of the villagers, and the closer they got, the heavier the air became, thick with secrets too terrible to speak aloud. At the bottom of the staircase, the explorers stepped into a chamber that defied belief. The room was circular, its walls carved from smooth stone that seemed unnaturally cold to the touch. In the dim light of their flashlights, they could see the belongings of the missing villagers scattered across the floor, clothes folded neatly, journals lying open, shoes lined up as if the owners had simply vanished mid-use. It was an unsettling, frozen scene of everyday life, a snapshot captured in time, untouched for 20 years. Nothing seemed disturbed, yet the absence of the villagers made the room feel alive with something unseen. The walls were covered with strange markings, symbols etched deep into the stone, some resembling human figures twisted in silent agony, others geometric patterns that made the explorers' heads spin. The carvings seemed to move subtly in the corner of their eyes, flickering in the shadows like living entities. It was impossible to decipher their meaning, but an overwhelming sense of dread radiated from them, as though the walls themselves were warning intruders to leave. Even the bravest among them felt a tightening in their chest, a pull toward panic, as though the chamber was aware of their presence and disapproved. In the center of the room lay a circular stone platform, slightly raised, and covered in dust. Upon closer inspection, they realized it bore remnants of something once active, burn marks, faint stains, and a pattern that suggested a ritual of some kind. The explorers exchanged nervous glances, realizing this was no ordinary basement or storage room. This platform, with its eerie perfection, seemed to be the heart of whatever had consumed the village. As they approached it, the air grew heavier, almost suffocating, and the shadows along the walls deepened unnaturally, stretching toward them with intent. Scattered around the chamber were personal items, toys with chipped paint, letters never sent, journals filled with handwriting that stopped abruptly mid-sentence. It was clear that the villagers hadn't just left. They had been taken, ripped from their lives in an instant. The explorers felt an icy grip of terror as they considered the implications. Something had claimed Hawthorne, something powerful and malevolent, leaving only echoes of human life behind. Every object seemed to radiate the energy of absence, a silent scream frozen in the air that made it impossible to ignore. As they shined their lights across the room, the explorers began noticing more subtle, disturbing details. Small scratches lined the edges of the platform, as if people had tried desperately to climb away. Dust swirled unnaturally around certain areas, forming shapes that resembled hands or faces for just a heartbeat before fading. And then, faintly at first, they heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible footstep echo from somewhere above, in the church. It wasn't just their imagination. Something was moving unseen, aware of their intrusion, reminding them that this hidden chamber wasn't just a tomb for belongings. It had been a stage for something alive, something waiting. As the explorers slowly backed away from the stone platform, a sense of dread settled over them like a suffocating fog. Every instinct screamed to leave, yet the air seemed to thicken with anticipation, almost as if the chamber itself were alive and watching. Shadows stretched along the walls, stretching unnaturally, flickering as though reacting to the explorers' every movement. The faint sound of footsteps from above grew louder, echoing in the chamber as if someone, or something, was descending toward them, though the stairs were empty. Fear clawed at their throats, making it hard to breathe as the realization dawned. Whatever had taken Hawthorne's villagers might still be here. They tried to rationalize what they were seeing. Perhaps the villagers had fled or had been abducted by a cult, some human explanation. But the chamber, with its perfectly preserved belongings and ritualistic stone platform, suggested something far beyond human comprehension. The carvings on the walls seemed to pulse faintly, responding to their fear, almost like a heartbeat. A low, guttural hum began to echo through the chamber, vibrating through their bones, originating from the shadows themselves. The explorers exchanged terrified glances, knowing they had stumbled into something that defied reality and logic. A sudden movement caught the corner of one explorer's eye. A shadow darted across the floor, just out of reach of the flashlight beams. It wasn't human, yet it mimicked movement like it was watching, learning, testing them. A chill ran down their spines as they realized the chamber wasn't empty. Whatever force had claimed the villagers was still present, lingering, patiently waiting for the next victim to stumble into its domain. The weight of the atmosphere pressed down on them, each breath feeling heavier than the last. The faint echo of voices, whispers of the missing villagers, seemed to rise from the walls themselves, carrying a tone of warning that sent shivers through their very souls. The explorers tried to flee, retracing their steps up the staircase, but the darkness seemed to shift around them. Each step they took felt longer, the staircase stretching unnaturally, bending reality itself. The whispering voices grew louder, more insistent, as though urging them to stay or threatening them with something terrible if they left. One of the explorers glanced back and swore they saw a pale figure emerge from the shadows, its features impossible to comprehend, standing just beyond the threshold of the hidden door. A cold wind blew upward, extinguishing their flashlights for a heartbeat, and in that instant, the weight of the missing villagers' fate pressed upon them. It became terrifyingly clear that the story of Hawthorne would never be fully understood. The villagers hadn't simply disappeared. They had been claimed, trapped in some otherworldly force, existing in a space that defied time and reality. The hidden door, the chamber, the stone platform, they were not just relics of a past tragedy. They were part of a living, breathing mystery, one that had remained hidden for decades, waiting for anyone foolish enough to uncover it. The explorers' panic rose with every echo, every shifting shadow, leaving them to realize that Hawthorne's secret was far from over, and the forces that had taken the village might still be watching, still waiting for the next intruder to step inside. As the explorers finally stumbled back toward the hidden door, their hearts pounding and breath ragged, they realized something that made the hairs on their necks stand on end. The church wasn't done with them. The faint whispers of the villagers seemed to follow them, echoing from the walls and shadows, urging them to leave, warning them to never return. When they finally stepped outside into the cold night air, the forest around Hawthorne seemed unnaturally still, almost expectant. The village behind them remained silent, frozen in time, as if it were holding its secrets close, daring anyone to uncover them again. Even after they left, none of the explorers spoke about what they had seen. Not to friends, not to the authorities. But deep down, each of them knew the truth. Hawthorne wasn't just a village that disappeared. It was a place where the line between this world and something far darker had been crossed. And the hidden door, the chamber, the villagers, they were all still there, waiting. Waiting for the next curious soul brave, or foolish, enough to enter. So if you ever find yourself near the rolling hills of rural America, and you stumble upon an abandoned church in the middle of a forgotten town, remember Hawthorne. Listen carefully to the silence, watch the shadows closely, and never, ever open doors that were meant to stay closed. Because some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, and some disappearances aren't meant to be explained.
If you liked this video, don't forget to hit that like button, share it with your friends, and drop your thoughts in the comments below. Most importantly, subscribe and hit the bell icon so the next secret finds you first.